in terms of parliament. But as you get deep and deep into the term, and there are disagreements between both houses, then the urge to withdraw or to ignore the Senate, rather, Mr. Speaker, clicks in. And on those occasions, you find that Senate ends up suffering. Mr. Speaker, finally, just as way of concluding, and this I have picked randomly, I am just reflecting on colleague senators that we've had the privilege of serving with over the last 10 years, and moments and things that they did that will remain forever etched in the memory or the history of Senate, Mr. Speaker, for those acts have defined us, who we are today and what we shall be in the future. Number one, Mr. Speaker, Senate Speaker Ekwe Ethuro. I know for a fact, and I speak like this, Mr. Speaker, because I belong to his side of the political divide, then and even up to now, that part of the reason why he lost his job as Speaker of the Senate, and I don't think this is something that you need to be hearing, Mr. Speaker, is that on many occasions in the 11th Parliament, he was called to defend the position of the Senate against what you'd call, quote unquote, the appointing authority. Some of them extremely powerful, Mr. Speaker. But because he stood firm in defense of this House, unfortunately, he never made it as he would have wished to return as a Speaker of this House. And I know that that's a huge price that he paid, but we continue to celebrate him. I celebrate him each day. He's one of the gentlemen who, when for one reason or the other I bump into him, I bow in honor because of what he did for this institution during very difficult times, Mr. Speaker, including days when police officers were sent to cordon the House of Parliament. He stopped debate for close to 30 minutes until police officers moved away from Parliament. And of course, you know who had sent police officers then. It's not an easy decision. That seat that you sit on, Mr. Speaker, sometimes calls on you to make very, very difficult decisions in defense of this House, Mr. Speaker. And for that reason, I celebrate Senator Ekwe Ethuro. Secondly, the Senator Professor Kindiki served as our first majority leader on this side of the House where I lead. Had the privilege of serving under him as a new senator, guided many of us that were new to Parliament then, even though even him was his first term of Parliament, had quickly learned the ropes and guided us, afforded us the opportunity to lay a firm foundation, and I believe that is what has guided many of us to secure and set up a firm foundation. Of course, he led in the institutionalizing of bipartisan approach on matters concerning the role and the place of Senate on devolution. That is something which, unfortunately, this House still continues to grapple with. And over time, I hope, as leader of majority, together with my counterpart, the leader of minority, we shall indoctrinate the current crop of colleague senators to appreciate that while we may disagree on the politics of the day, when it comes to matters defense of devolution and the institution of Senate, we fight together like brothers and sisters. We stand our ground together and we ensure that we stand and achieve that. That is one of the leading edicts and the teachings of Professor Kindiki on this House when he spoke many afternoons to speak. Of course, the Right Honorable Speaker of the National Assembly, Speaker Moses Masika Wetangula, then as leader of minority. Very interesting debates on many afternoons, Mr. Speaker. And I wish I said this when many of our colleague senators were here in the afternoon, because I continue to see in this House an unfortunate emerging trend, Mr. Speaker, where debate is losing its pace. I enjoyed those afternoons as a newcomer into this House, Mr. Speaker, where even though people are saying extremely difficult and sometimes harsh things to each other, those that were being spoken to kept quiet and allowed colleagues to make their point first before rising to counter whatever is being argued. That's a culture of debate. That's what Parliament is about, Mr. Speaker. And that's a culture which Senator Moses Masika Wetangula deeply espouses. Many afternoons kept this House entertained with his quotes from various books. Senator James Orengo, second leader of minority, Mr. Speaker, and now Governor for Siaya, stood steadfast in his defense of the Senate, together with other senior counsels from this House, defended the Senate when we went to the High Court, Court of Appeal. Unfortunately, perhaps because of his many engagements now in Siaya County, Mr. Speaker, hasn't been able to do that. at the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker, but of course is being ably helped by our colleague, the Senator for Nyamira, Senior Counsel Senator Omogeni. We celebrate his work. Senator Kiraitu Murungi led in the quest for strengthening of oversight role of the Senate in its and the place of Senate in the Parliamentary Service Commission. And I wish I said this when our colleagues in PSC were there, because when it became untenable and we felt that we were being shortchanged by our colleagues in the National Assembly, Senator Kiraitu Murungi one afternoon moved a motion in this House, Mr. Speaker, to have PSC split between two, to have a PSC for the National Assembly, one for the Senate. When that agitation began, at least, though for nuisance value and very little legal value of it, Mr. Speaker, because it will never have passed in the Assembly, at least got that third, or I think it was the fourth commission of PSC, Senator Omogeni, to take Senate seriously. And after that, there was a change in attitude in how PSC treated Senate as an institution. Of course, that danger always lurks, and you must remain vigilant. Senator Fatuma Dulo led in the quest for strengthening of oversight role of a Senate, continues to celebrate her serving her second term as a woman senator. Not many women have been elected to represent counties in this House. She leads a distinguishing role, Mr. Speaker, having been elected twice to this House, of course, previously having then served as a nominated senator. A challenge to colleague senators who are nominated to know that you can start and build a stellar career from your nomination. That's what Senator Fatuma Dulo has done. Senator Kipchumba Murkomen served as Deputy Majority Leader, then later on as Majority Leader, stood steadfast in defense of Senate and devolution. I recall part of the very first committees that I enjoyed their sittings as a new member of this House was Devolution Committee, Mr. Speaker. And I wish, I don't know if Senator Abbas is in the House, Mr. Speaker, that the present Devolution Committee takes time to study the work that was done by the Devolution Committee of the Second Senate. Remember, that was a time that we were just turning the curve, Mr. Speaker, and getting into the cycle of devolution as a country. Therefore, there were many laws that needed to be passed, many challenges in the county governments. I recall the amount of work that they did. Traveled actually most of the afternoon. They missed plenary sittings, resolving disputes between governors and their deputies, county assemblies, and so on and so forth, Mr. Speaker. I wish that be the guiding spirit of the present Devolution Committee, chaired by the very able Senator Abbas. Senator Bill Okero, my first chairperson of the Budget and Finance Committee, a committee whose job and duty I took with utmost zeal and enjoyed serving. Perhaps my best committee, the committee that I enjoyed serving in the most and gave me an understanding of the place of the institution of Senate, was under the chairmanship of Senator Bill Okero, Mr. Speaker. Served that committee, ensured that our reports, especially on BPS, Mr. Speaker, though ignored by the Treasury, will always find a way of either speaking and closing ranks with our colleagues from the National Assembly, despite the fact that those times there existed very frustrated relationships between both houses, Mr. Speaker, but also generally guided us in pushing for the place of devolution. When we began about conditional grants, Mr. Speaker, and so many amendments to the PFM guided by Senator Bill Okero. Senator Dr. Boni Halwale, our whip, Mr. Speaker, chaired the first committee of the County Public Accounts and Investment Committee and led the committee in establishing institutionalization of oversight on county governments as contemplated in Article 96. This was the first PAC committee that dealt with county governments. Remember, CPAC before was dealing only, when we were unicameral, Mr. Speaker, was dealing only with our colleagues, with oversighting the national government. But Senator Boni Halwale led this committee with great honor and distinction. I remember the many reports that he tabled before this House. And on that, courtesy of the work that his committee did, many county governments reformed and actually ensured that there was prudent use of public resources, a culture that is quickly waning away, Mr. Speaker, and it's not something to be celebrated. I wish to challenge our colleague senators to take keen advantage of the reports, first of all, of CPIC, but second and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, even the audit reports. I see many occasions when I first came to this House, Mr. Speaker, when reports of Auditor General were tabled here by then Majority Leader, you'd see senators camper for the same, to pick a copy and see how their counties are doing. Nowadays, they lie idle, almost falling over on the clerk's table until they are carted away, Mr. Speaker, by the sergeant at arms. I think that's an area that, as a House, we need to improve and pay keen attention. Of course, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken about this, and it's something that I continue to engage my colleagues on the minority side about the need to perhaps rethink the place of oversight, to not only be reactionary to the